came at 6:14 in the morning. Not from my supervisor, not from HR, from the building's main security desk, asking me to confirm whether I'd be coming in to finalize my access termination paperwork. I'd been expecting it for weeks, but hearing it said out loud in that flat administrative tone, access termination, made something tighten in my chest that I hadn't prepared for. I told them I'd be there by 8. I sat at the kitchen table for a while after that. My wife had already left for her shift at the hospital. The house was quiet, in the way it only gets when you're the only one in it and you know something is ending. I drank my coffee. I looked at the backyard we'd landscaped together 5 summers ago. The oak tree my daughter had planted when she was 9. The raised beds where I used to grow tomatoes before the hours got too long to care about tomatoes. 26 years. That's how long I'd given Meridian Financial Group. I started there at 31 when my daughter was 3 and we were still renting a 2-bedroom apartment in Columbus, Ohio, and I drove a 97 Civic with a cracked dashboard. I came in as a mid-level compliance analyst and worked my way up because I genuinely believed in what we were doing, helping mid-sized businesses navigate financing, structuring loans that didn't trap people, building a system that was supposed to operate with some integrity. By year 8, I was running the entire regulatory compliance division. By year 15, I was the one they called when federal auditors showed up unannounced. And 2 weeks before my 62nd birthday, 3 weeks before my retirement date, the CFO called me into a glass-walled conference room and told me my position had been eliminated. He couldn't look at me directly when he said it. He kept glancing at the window, at the parking structure across the street, at the coffee cup in front of him. My supervisor sat beside him and stared at the table. HR had a folder. They always have a folder. I asked if this was final. The CFO nodded. I said, "You just didn't want to pay out the pension." Nobody answered that, but the HR director shifted in her seat, and that told me everything I needed to know. Here's the thing about a pension that vests at 62 after 25 years of continuous service. It's not a gift. It's a contractual obligation. It's deferred compensation you earned over decades of work, structured so the company holds it until you hit the threshold. And Meridian's threshold for my tier was 62 years old, 25 years of service. I had turned 61 the previous November. I had 26 years of service. The pension was worth, depending on market conditions and the actuarial formula, somewhere between $2.1 and $2.4 million over my projected lifetime, plus a monthly payment that would have started at about $6,800 and adjusted for inflation. They fired me 3 weeks before the clock hit. 3 weeks. I didn't argue in that room. I didn't raise my voice. I'd been in enough high-stakes conversations to know that anything you say in that moment gets used against you in the severance negotiation, and I had no intention of making this easy for them. I took the folder. I said I'd have my attorney review the paperwork before signing anything. The CFO said that was fine. My supervisor still hadn't said a single word. I walked back to my office, packed the things I'd need immediately into a laptop bag, and I left the rest. I took the elevator down. I handed my badge to the security desk, signed the visitor log one final time out of habit, and walked to my car. I sat in the parking garage for about 20 minutes. Then I drove home and called my attorney. What I haven't told you yet is about the documentation system. I'm not an IT person. I want to be clear about that. I'm a compliance professional. My job for 26 years was to understand regulations, interpret federal guidelines, map them to internal processes, and make sure that when an auditor walked in the door, Meridian could prove it had done what it was supposed to do. That requires an extraordinary amount of documentation. Policies, procedures, audit trails, exception reports, approval chains, the paper trail that proves the company's decisions were legally defensible. Over the course of 2 decades, I had built something that the company depended on so completely that most people had forgotten I'd built it. They just thought it had always been there. I called it TRACE, Transparent Regulatory Audit Compliance Engine, technically, but I'd stopped using the full name sometime around year 7. It was a documentation infrastructure, not a single piece of software, but a methodology embedded into dozens of systems, with a master index only I fully understood. Every regulatory filing, every internal audit response, every exception approval, every correspondence with the OCC or the FDIC, all of it ran through Trace's organizational structure, cross-referenced, time-stamped, categorized in a way that only made complete sense if you understood the compliance logic I'd built it around. I had documented Trace extensively. The documentation was thorough, accurate, and genuinely helpful if you already understood compliance architecture at a level that most people at Meridian did not. I had also flagged in writing on 4 separate occasions over the past decade that my retirement would require a formal transition period of no less than 60 days to properly transfer institutional knowledge. The last memo I sent on this subject was dated 14 months before I was terminated. The CFO's office had acknowledged receipt. Nothing had happened. When they fired me with 3 weeks' notice, they also didn't ask for a transition period. They just said my access would be terminated at the end of the week, and that I should use those remaining days to finish any documentation handoff. 3 weeks. After 26 years of building something they didn't fully understand. I spent those 3 weeks doing exactly what they asked. I organized everything. I updated every procedure document. I left clean, accurate records. I did not sabotage anything. I did not delete anything. I did not introduce any errors or inconsistencies. I simply organized everything in the way that made complete sense to me, and only me. And I made sure the master index, the single document that would let someone navigate Trace without already knowing it, was stored in a location that was technically accessible to anyone with my permission level, which I no longer had. It wasn't a trap. It was just an organization system that required its architect to interpret it. Like a library where only one person knows the catalog is written in a logic they developed themselves. I handed back my badge on a Thursday morning. The federal examination started the following Monday. I need to tell you about my daughter first, because this is the part that matters most, and I don't want it to get lost in what comes after. She's 32 now. She works in public health administration in Cincinnati. She has her mother's stubbornness and my habit of writing things down that I can't quite say out loud. We'd had a complicated few years, not a falling out exactly, but the kind of drift that happens when your child becomes a full adult, and you're both busy, and nobody picks up the phone as much as they should. The Friday before my last day, she drove up from Cincinnati, didn't tell me she was coming. I came downstairs in the morning, and she was at the kitchen table with her mother, and she'd brought a tin of the coffee I like, that she'd found at a market near her apartment, and she printed out a photograph of the two of us from the summer she'd turned 12. We'd driven to Hocking Hills, just the two of us, her first big hike. She'd framed it. She handed it to me without saying much. That's when I cried. Not in the CFO's office, not in the parking garage, not when I called my attorney, or when I sat with my wife going through the financial projections for the first time without a pension in them. I cried in my kitchen on a Friday morning because my daughter had driven 3 hours to sit with me, and I realized I had spent 26 years trying to secure a future for my family, and had missed things I couldn't get back. We talked for a long time that morning. She asked me what I was going to do. I told her I didn't know yet. She said, "You built something that can't run without you." That's not nothing, Dad. She said it matter-of-factly, the way she says things that cut straight to the point, and I didn't say anything back because she was right and we both knew it. That night, after she'd gone to sleep, I sat at my desk for about 2 hours. I reviewed the organization structure of Trace one more time. I made a list of every regulatory filing scheduled for the next 6 months, every examination cycle, every audit committee report. I looked at the federal examination calendar. The OCC routine examination was scheduled to begin March 17th. That was 8 days after my badge termination date. I closed my laptop and went to bed. The examination began as expected. 3 OCC examiners arrived at Meridian's downtown Columbus office on the morning of March 17th. Standard procedure for a bank Meridian's size, a mid-cycle review focused on compliance management systems, BSA AML documentation, and credit risk oversight. Nothing unusual. Meridian had gone through these before, without incident, largely because of the systems I had built. I know what happened inside because my former colleague, a woman who'd been in the credit risk department for 12 years and had no involvement in my termination, called me 2 days into the examination. She was careful about what she said, but she said enough. The examiners had asked for the compliance documentation index. The current compliance director, a man who had been hired 8 months before my termination and had spent most of that time restructuring the team rather than learning the systems, had provided access to Trace. The examiners started navigating it. And they couldn't. Not because it was broken, not because anything was missing. Everything was there, accurate and complete, but the organizational logic of Trace was not intuitive to someone who hadn't built it or been trained in it. The cross-referencing system used a classification framework I had developed over 15 years, drawing on federal regulatory categories in a specific hierarchical structure that made perfect sense once you understood it and made no sense at all if you didn't. The exception approval trails were embedded in subdirectories that were labeled according to a shorthand I had used for so long nobody had questioned it. The correspondence archives were organized by examination cycle and regulatory body in a way that required knowing which examination mapped to which cycle year, which was documented in the master index that was stored in the location I'd mentioned. The compliance director apparently spent the better part of a day trying to navigate trace before escalating to the CFO. The CFO called the head of IT, who confirmed that all the data was present and accessible, but that understanding the structure required knowledge of how it had been built. Someone asked if there was documentation for the documentation system. There was, in trace, which they couldn't navigate. My colleague said the CFO's face, when the IT director explained this, looked like a man who had just understood something very expensive. They called me on day 3. Not the CFO. He sent the head of HR. She was professional about it. She said Meridian was facing an active regulatory examination and was experiencing some difficulty with the compliance documentation system and wanted to know if I'd be available to consult. I asked what the consulting rate would be. There was a pause. She said they'd been thinking in terms of my previous salary rate. I said I appreciated that, but my consulting rate was considerably different from my salary rate. Another pause. She asked what I had in mind. I told her. There was a longer pause. She said she'd need to discuss it with the CFO and would call back. She called back 2 hours later. Here's what I need you to understand about what I did and didn't do. I did not create a crisis. The crisis existed the moment they chose to terminate an employee with critical institutional knowledge without a proper transition, 3 weeks before a federal examination, with no plan for knowledge transfer. I had told them, in writing, 4 times that this would happen. Not this specifically, but something like this. An organization that depends on one person's knowledge without redundancy is an organization with a risk they've chosen not to manage. I did not extort anyone. I quoted a consulting rate. It was high. It was also market rate for a compliance professional with my credentials and experience who was being brought in to manage an active federal examination, and my credentials and experience included having built the exact system they needed help with. If they'd hired me as an outside consultant through a firm, they'd have paid more. I made that point clearly. I did not want revenge. I want to be honest about that, because I've had time to think about it, and I don't think revenge is what I was after. What I wanted was for the people who had made a calculation, who had decided that 3 weeks was sufficient notice, that my pension was a liability worth eliminating, that 26 years of institutional knowledge could be managed with a folder and a handshake, to understand the actual cost of that calculation, not emotionally, financially, in terms they spoke fluently. My attorney was involved in every conversation. Everything was documented. The consulting agreement was straightforward and legal. I worked with Meridian for 11 days during the OCC examination. I provided the compliance documentation they needed. I answered the examiner's questions. I made sure nothing went wrong because nothing going wrong was not just in Meridian's interest. It was also in the interest of Meridian's customers, who had nothing to do with any of this. That mattered to me. It still matters to me. The OCC issued its report 6 weeks later. Meridian received a matters requiring attention citation, not a formal enforcement action, but a serious finding, related to deficiencies in their compliance management succession planning, specifically the lack of documented knowledge transfer protocols for key compliance personnel. The CFO had to personally present a remediation plan to the board. My consulting fee, paid in full, was $187,000. It was not the $2.1 million pension. Let me be clear about that. It didn't replace what they took from me, and I am still in litigation over the wrongful termination claim, which is a separate matter, and one my attorney says is strong, given the timing and the documented pension vesting schedule. That case is ongoing. But the $187,000 was real and immediate, and it came from the CFO's discretionary budget, which I found out later he had to explain line by line to the board's audit committee. My daughter called me the evening after I finalized the consulting agreement. I told her the number. There was a long silence and then she laughed. Not the kind of laugh that's happy, exactly, but the kind that happens when something turns out to be exactly what it looked like it would be. She said, "I told you, they couldn't run it without you." I said, "It shouldn't have had to be this way." She said, "I know, but it is what it is, Dad." We talked for almost an hour, about the litigation, about what I was going to do with the time, about the tomatoes, because she'd been asking me to get back to the garden for years. She said her apartment had too much shade for raised beds, but she'd been growing herbs on the windowsill and had gotten surprisingly good at it. I told her to come up in June when the growing season started and we figure out the tomatoes together. She said she would. I believed her. Here's the part I keep thinking about. Months later, the compliance director who couldn't navigate Trace. He wasn't incompetent. He was new. He'd never been trained, because nobody had made training him a priority, because the person who should have trained him was being quietly edged out of relevance in the final months before his termination. I watched it happen. I raised it in one of those 4 memos. I said this person needs to shadow me for a minimum of 90 days before I leave. I said it clearly. I said the examination cycle timing made this urgent. Nobody acted on it. There's a version of the story where Meridian's leadership was simply careless, where the decision to terminate me early was made by financial minds thinking about a pension liability, and not by operational minds thinking about what happens when an examination starts and the documentation. Architect is gone. I've thought about that version a lot because it's more charitable and it might even be true. But I also think about this. I sent 4 memos over 10 years. I was specific. I was professional. I documented the risk in plain language, with timelines, with recommendations, with cost estimates. And each time, the response was silence or a vague acknowledgement and then nothing. So at some point, carelessness and choice start to look the same. They knew I was leaving. They knew when. They knew what I'd built. They decided it wasn't worth managing properly. What I know now, what I've had to sit with and accept, is that you can be loyal to a system, to a company, to a mission, and the system can be grateful for your work and still see you, at the end, as a line item, a pension liability, an HR problem to be managed efficiently out the door. That's not cynicism, it's just a thing that happens, and I think the reason the story I'm telling you lands the way it does, for me at least, isn't the consulting fee, and it isn't even the litigation. It's the moment in my kitchen on a Friday morning when my daughter handed me that photograph without saying much. Because that moment was free. Nobody could calculate the value of that or eliminate it before it vested. I'm growing tomatoes this summer. She's coming in June. The documentation system is still running at Meridian. I understand they've since hired a second compliance architect to study it properly and build redundancy. I hope they've done it well. I genuinely do. I took the photograph she gave me. I framed it on the shelf above my desk. Some things, once built, don't forget who built them. And some things, the ones that actually matter, were never part of the compensation package to begin with. I keep coming back to the 4 memos. Not the consulting agreement, not the $187,000, not the OCC citation that the CFO had to explain line by line to the board. I keep coming back to 4 memos I wrote over 10 years in plain language with specific timelines and cost estimates, warning exactly what would happen if institutional knowledge wasn't transferred properly before I left. 4 times I tried to hand them the answer before the problem started. 4 times, nothing. There's something I've had to sit with in the months since all of this. The outcome wasn't accidental. When you ignore a warning once, maybe you were busy. When you ignore it 4 times over a decade, you've made a choice. And choices like that. Choices that treat a person's expertise as infinitely available and their future as infinitely disposable, eventually meet their consequences. Not because the universe punishes anyone, just because systems have logic, and logic doesn't care whether you respected the person who built it. I didn't build Trace to hold anyone hostage. I built it because I was good at my work and I cared about doing it right. The fact that it became leverage wasn't something I engineered. It was something that emerged from 26 years of doing the job with integrity, while the people above me treated integrity as a nice to have. You reap what you cultivate. That's not philosophy. That's just how organizations work. What I know now, and what I wish someone had told me at 31 when I first walked into that building, is that the sharpest thing you can bring to a long career isn't loyalty. It's clarity. Clarity about what you're building, who it belongs to, and what happens when the people you built it for stop seeing you as a person and start seeing you as a cost. I spent 26 years being thorough, being careful, being the one who stayed late and documented everything and flagged the problems nobody wanted to hear about. That discipline protected me in the end, not because I planned it that way, because that's what sustained honest work actually does. It accumulates into something real, even when nobody's watching. And then there's my daughter, who drove 3 hours without being asked, set a framed photograph on the kitchen table, and said less than 100 words that meant more than any of it. I've thought about that morning more than I've thought about the CFO's face when the IT director finished explaining the situation to him, because what she reminded me, just by showing up, is that the things worth building aren't always on a balance sheet. The endurance it took to get through those final weeks, to stay professional, to not let bitterness drive the decisions, that didn't come from nowhere. It came from knowing who I was, independent of that job title, independent of that badge, independent of a pension that a room full of people had decided I didn't deserve. When you know what you stand for, losing something doesn't hollow you out the way they expect it to. I'm growing tomatoes this summer. She's coming in June. Some things you build outlast the people who underestimated them, and some mornings, that's enough.